Clarendon County, South Carolina, 1947. On the sand road between Davis Station and Somerton, a school bus carrying white children passed the same stretch of road twice a day that Black children and the same DSTRCT walked on foot. The county operated roughly 30 school buses that year. All of them were reserved for WHT students. Black students, who made up about 3/4 of the district's school-age population, had none. Levi Pearson farmed land that straddled 2 school districts near Davis Station. His 3 children, James, Eloise, and Daisy, walked 9 miles one way to reach the nearest school built for Black students. In a nearby settlement called Jordan, some children's daily round trip ran as long as 16 miles. Where the land was low and wet, some walked a stretch of road that flooded, and some cauldron crossed water and rode paddle boats to get to a classroom at all. This was not an oversight in scheduling. Clarendon County School Board had made a specific allocation decision, repeated every budget cycle. Bus funds went to white schools and did not go to Black schools. The reasoning the superintendent gave, when asked directly, was that Black residents did not pay enough in property taxes to justify the cost. Levi Pearson did not accept that reasoning as final. In 1947, he began the process that would take his name to federal court, not to challenge the government's authority to tax property, but to challenge the government's authority to tax property at Allo Federal Court. Not to challenge segregation in principle at first, but to ask for a bus. That distinction matters, because it is the difference between what he was legally allowed to request in 1947 and what the case eventually became by 1951. What did a county government's transportation budget, examined stop by stop and bus by bus, actually show about how separate but equal was being applied in practice on this specific stretch of road? And what did it cost Levi Pearson personally to be the man who asked the question out loud? The 30 buses the county ran for white students were not an accident of geography. They were the visible end of a specific funding structure. School district budgets in Clarendon County in this period allocated dramatically more per white student than per Black student. One documented account puts it at roughly $179 spent per white child, against $43 per Black child, per wet decline against $43 per Black in a school year. Another documented estimate values the building serving the DSTRCT students, about 2,300 children, at nearly $391,000, against roughly $64,000 for the buildings serving the DSTRCT's approximately 6,000 Black students. The bus allocating followed the same ratio as everything else. A school bus mechanically is not an expensive or complicated machine to operate. A body on a truck chassis, seats, a door, fuel, a driver. What made bus access a matter of law rather than logistics was that the county had already decided, as policy, which children's transportation counted as a public responsibility, and which did not. When Black families in the Davis Station community grew tired of waiting, they did what the county would not. In 1946, Levi Pearson, his brother Hammett, and their neighbor Joseph Lemon raised roughly $700 among themselves and bought a used bus. It broke down constantly. The county would not pay for its gas or its repairs. Families kept it running out of pocket for as long as they could, and asked, formally, for the district to take over its maintenance or provide a real one. The superintendent, Roderick Elliott, refused, on the stated basis that the Black community's tax contribution did not justify the expense. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific, sourced element of American school transportation history, not composite nostalgia, but the documented systems, the named people who lived inside them, and what those systems reveal when examined closely. Whether or not your own family's history touches this county's history touches your own's history touches this county. That's the record of what a school board decked at a bus seat was worth, and of the people who spent 7 years turning that Dexon into a Supreme Court case. If your own family has a documented account of segregated or unequal school transportation, north or south, We want to hear it in the comments. If your family walked to school while a bus passed you on the same road, or worked to secure that first bus for your community, tell us what that road looked like. The next video in this strand goes inside the schoolhouses themselves, the buildings the equalization campaign built between 1951 and 1955, and what they did and did not fix. Back on Route 26, what did Levi Pearson's family and the Davis Station community around them actually know, mechanically and administratively, about keeping a used bus alive with no county support, that the county's own transportation office had never had to learn? In 1947, Lev Pearson wrote to the Clarendon County School District requesting that black children receive the same bus transportation would color in the district he already had. He mailed it and he waited. When the district did not respond, he engaged legal help. First the South Carolina NAACP's Harold Boulware, then Thurgood Marshall, at the time a rising attorney for the national NAACP legal team. The lawsuit that followed, filed in 1948, was narrow by design. It asked the court to apply the existing legal standard of the era, separate but equal, established by Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, to a single concrete failure: unequal transportation. Marshall's argument was straightforward. If the county provided buses to one group of students, providing none to another group of students in the same district was not equal under the county's own operating rules, regardless of whether segregation itself was challenged. The county's response was not to defend the policy in open court. The day before trial, the school district's attorneys pointed out that Pearson's farmland crossed into more than one school district, and argued he therefore lacked standing to sue on behalf of children attending school in this particular district. The case was dismissed on that technicality in 1948, not because the underlying facts were disputed, but because of where his property line happened to run. Pearson's brother Hammett, who did not have the same jurisdictional problem, offered to take his place. What Pearson had done, in the meantime, was demonstrate, on the public record under his own name, what asking the question cost a black landowner in Clarendon County: shots fired into his home, banks that withdrew his credit, and neighboring farmers who would no longer lend him equipment. What did the dismissal of Pearson versus Clarendon County on a property law technicality teach the NAACP's legal strategists about the LMTs of asking narrowly for equal buses, and what did push them toward asking for instead? Consider what the 9-mile walk to Scott's Branch School actually meant in daily, physical terms for a child in the Pearson family, or any of the families around Davis Station. 9 miles one way is roughly 3 hours of walking at a child's pace, before the school day starts and after it ends. In a coastal South Carolina climate that ran through summer heat, hurricane season rain, and winter cold, in the Jordan community nearby, some children's daily round trip reached 16 miles. Some stretches flooded in wet seasons, and some crossings required a boat. This was not incidental to the education those children received. It was a direct cost subtracted from it. A child who has already walked several hours before the first class begins arrives tired in a way rested classmates do not. A child who must begin the walk home while there is still daylight loses study time, homework time, and rest that a bus child down the same road keeps. None of this appears in an attendance record as unequal transportation. It appears as absence, as lateness, as fatigue that a teacher has no way to separate from a student's effort or ability. And it happened in direct daily view of the alternative. The same county road that these children walked was the road the BHT student bus used. Multiple documented accounts from Clarendon County and from the broader Brown v. Board record describe exactly this. Black children on foot, white children dang past them on the same stretch of road, to a better equipped school, every school day of the year. What this demonstrated, without a single word of legal argument, was the specs mechanism of separate but equal, as actually practiced. Separate, certainly. Equal, never, and visibly never, on the same road, twice a day. What would it take, legally, not morally, to turn what these children experienced on that road into evidence a federal court would accept. To understand what equal meant on paper but not in practice, it helps to step back to the legal framework both sides were operating inside. Plessy versus Ferguson, decided by the Supreme Court in 1896, held that racial segregation in public facilities was constitutional as long as the separate facilities provided were equal. Southern states, including South Carolina, built their entire public school systems on that ruling for the following half-century. In practice, the equal half of the standard was rarely enforced and rarely tested in court, because doing so required a plaintiff willing to sue their own local government publicly, by name, in a place where doing so carried real personal risk. That is what made Clarendon County unusual, not the underlying disparity, which existed across the segregated South. What made it unusual was that a specific group of people, Lev Pearson, his brother Hammett, their neighbor Joseph Lemon, and later Reverend Joseph A. DeLon, and more than 100 petition signers organized around him, were willing to put their names on a legal challenge to it, in a county where the school board chairman, Roderick Elliott, also stated plainly when asked that black residents' tax contributions did not justify a bus. The schoolhouses these families' children attended were themselves part of the same equation themselves, part of the same equation. Many black schools in Clarendon County had begun in churches or Masonic lodges, and later moved into buildings that communities built or funded largely themselves, and without electricity, indoor plumbing, or heating beyond a single wood stove. White schools in the same district were brick, wired, and equipped. A bus was one visible piece of a larger comprehensive funding gap. Not the whole of it, but the piece a federal lawsuit could most concretely measure and prove. What made Reverend Delane, a local educator and minister rather than a lawyer, want to organs 100 of H's neighbors to asking their names to a patent that the county was already on record red allotting against.
By 1949, the goal Reverend DeLopez and Hebschmers were organizing around had changed. Thurgood Marshall and the Nat Schnapp had concluded, after the 1948 D's Esmer, that a narrow transport aid on lawsuit was not a durable strategy. A favorable wrong, one county over one bus, would not change the underlying legal structure that let Plessy stand. If Clarendon County was going to be the test case, the NOC wanted to test segregate on itself, not just unequal Adam. Straton. On November 11, 1949, 107 Clarendon County respondents did a petition asking for equal facal, equal supples, equal transported on, and equal teachers, in effect, asking the trans to either fully equal, black schools or desegregate. The school board, not grant. In May 1950, with the Knox legal defense funds back, the case of Briggs v. Earl was formally folded, with Harry and Elza Briggs and roughly 20 other named plaintiffs stand for the broader group of pet owners. The retaliaput on that followed was emmed into ate and do spread, and it fell on people who had already taken the greater jobs of put-ing the greater jobs. Harry Briggs, an auto mechanwigs, and Hizfi, Elza, a motel ma, both lost their jobs. Most of the other Segners lost jobs, cred, or supplies from local merchants' weeks. Reverend Delad's home and later his church were burned. He was eventually forced to leave South Carolina for his own safety and did not return to left there. The case was heard by a 3-judge federal panel in Charleston, 1951. 2 of the 3 judges ruled for the school judge, ordering to equal, Zefak, Zay rather than desegregate. The 3-judge, J. Watt, Ingdo, assented, argue, in contrary to his colleagues, that segregate on itself was inherently unequal, regardless of how many buses or booled. Ingza County eventually provided. What it mean for the fam Lissu who had already paid to his cost, that the court's answer, for now, was to make the separate schools better, rather than to end the separate on itself. Hergs versus L. It moved through the courts. A parallel case was Bug. When Verurgarega, and 'tis worth being précis about how the two connect, since they are often collapsed, to one story. Clarendon County's case began over transported, on and expanded to challenge segregate, on rectly. Cooley's contraf, but on to what became Brown v. Board, began differently. April 1951, 16-year-old Barbara Rose Johns, Oregon, student strike at Robert Russa Moten, Turgay School, Turgay Edward County, protest, in overcrowded, underheated, tar paper-roofed classrooms, built as an overflow annex to the town's black school. That strike became Dov-Survey County School Board of Preens, Edward County one of the two Adsol, anal cases alongside a Delaware case and the Kansas case that would eventually lend name to the whole roll that the Supreme Court would consolidate together in 1954. What both had in common was the spec and meccan, and the Earler blocks and these v. Dio describe, a documented government-administered fact, is gap defended each case by local off, is as adequate and challenged by commune, is wing to accept real, imdiate retal, and on to have tested in federal court. Between 1951 and 1955, new rect response to Lev leaded, on pressure across the segregated South, South Carolina, and other states, but more than 700 new equals at in schools, for black students, modern balegs, some cases genuinely well disgained, intended to brackland black fac, ease up to the fisage, cal standard of white. Once Clarendon County's Scotts Branch School received a new buzz. As part of this wave, it was in a narrow sense exactly what Lev Pearson had, or inly asked for, 1947. Better face devs, better buses, are, ing 4 years later, and are, because the underly legal argument had, by then, moved past what Pearson alone had been permtoted to ask. What mean that the system could produce genuinely improved build ends and buses, direct response to a lawsuit, till the lawsuit itself was arguing that no amount of improved build ends and buses could make separate schools equal. In 1952, the Supreme Court concebs Earl, on appeal, sent back to the Dienst Court for a further hear, in light of the equals at on progress the county had reported. In March 1953, the Dienst Court found that real progress had been made toward physical equality. Thurgood Marshall's response to that, in not concede the case, he argued that even a fully equals tashel plant would stodle leave the underly harm untouched, because the harm was the separate on, not merely the dispar, T-bu-ones and buses. The case returned to the Supreme Court in 1954, where Delaware, Kansas, and D.St. of Columbia cases and to what the country now knows as Brown v. Board of Education on. On May 17, 1954, the court ruled unanimously that Rackstall segregati on public schools was unconstitutional, overturned the separate but equal doctrine that had governed Armor, can public educato, on Splessy, in 1896, Briggs v. Schools. L.Y. The case that began 7 years Earl, or as a request for a single school bus, was the first of the 5 cases the court had actually agreed to hear, and number in the docket, Y. Cares, that Aster, Cal, the docket, on. Even though the ruling bears the Kansas case's name, Judge War, who had determined 1951, favor of the posset on the Supreme Court ultimately adopted, had already returned to New York the year before the deck, on came down, worn down by Sauschel, Ostrickley, and Charleston. Reverend Delide did not return to South Carol to see the ruling from the pulp. He had already left. Harry Briggs, continued work, ing away from his family, Florida. None of the plied F's whose names carried the case received anything resembling imd braid, personal rest, Teuton for what the lawsuit had cost them. What did mean for a Supreme Court deck, onto a reeve in 1954 carry, ing the names of people who, by then, had already pot rates priests, and several cases, could no longer safely ref the place where they had pot. Brown v. Board struck down the legal basis for segregated schools, but did not on its own put a busk in Clarendon County the next morn. The court's 1955 follow-up rule, Brown II, called for desegregate on to proceed what it termed all del separate speed, a phrase that in practice allowed many southern school decks, including Clarendon counties, to delay actual integrat for years, sometimes over a decade, through legal maneuver, in school closures and out at deaf des. South Carolina's governor at the time publicly stated the state would not match worth and black children in schools, regardless of the rule, and some strows, the state chose to shut down public schools entirely rather than integrate them. What changed immediately and what did not, worth separate and clearly. What changed was to legal direct. Separate but equal no longer had constud. On'll stand anywhere in the United States, and every subsequent challenge to segregated faces, schools, transportate, on public, accommodate, could now case by case, that a spec, if in equal TV, olated Plessy's narrower standard, would not change imd Clarendon, for on the ground, in count, Zlicke Clarendon, where actual school integrat, on took years of further legal and Paulauf, Cal struggle to arrive, well into the 1960s, many places. The bus itself, the spec, see narrow Weng Lev, Pearson asked for in 1947, it's not a footnote to the story. It's the reason the story has the shape it has. A transported chow and lawsuit, to fix some lost, on a technicality, is why the Nazi concluded narrow requests could be defeated by narrow legal maneuvers, and chose stead to build the broader case that produced Brown. The bus the smallest on the inequality could be measured, in which exactly why was where the measurement started. What does mean that the spec, the mechanism where ended legal segregators, on a mare can educators, on began where, a father ask on where, Hainkin. Scott's Branch School, the school Lev Pearson's children had walked in Nemels to reach, received a new equal and on Arabu, in the early 1950s, before Brown was decutted. What the new buin gave the students who attended modern branch construct, on better lect, better heat. What not give them? The legal right to attend any school in the county on equal foot, in which are reived only with the 1954 rule, and practical, dolly terms, or reived only years after that, in most Clarendon County classrooms. Lev Pearson never saw his, or Hainel 1947 request granted. The form he first asked for. What he set mon out, dav the spec. See ask. Reverend Joseph A. DeLaw, Harry Briggs, Elza Briggs, and Lev Pearson were awarded the Congress Onal Gold Medal in 2003, posthumously, all four having Somerton, and before the Wreckingsalve, and Somerton, paved now. No one walks down to reach a schoolhouse walls no plumb. That spec hue, measurable fact, hue the part of this record that a school board's transported on budget could never have produced on own, if this channel's going to keep document what was in these systems and the people who lived in them, subscribe. There's more documented routes, disputes, and the spec. People who turned an unequal doculi commute to a legal record that changed a country's schools. Whether or not your own family's story touches this county, there's the record of what a bus seat was worth to a school board in 1947, and what cost the people who wested was worth more. If you have a documented family account, a route, a lawsuit, a pet on, a school your relatives fought to equal zay or integrate, put in the comments. We'd like to know what that road looked like in your family's a story. The next video, in the strand goes, ins the schoolhouses the equals at Encampa. Wilt what they fexed, and what they were never des, into fex. Lev Pearson wrote one letter, 1947. Ask the Clarendon County School D. Aft for a school bus. It took 7 years. 4 more plan. Af's names. A burned church. 2 lost jobs. 1 10-cent. Judge who never came home to Charleston. And a gunnon. Amos Supreme Court. For the country to answer hum.